Я буду говорить, я сейчас скажу на русском, и перевод будет на русский, потому что у нас есть гости из стран бывшего Советского Союза, Восточной Европы, Центральной Азии, которые не говорят по-украински, поэтому я думаю, что русский понимают все. Из вежливости мы будем, чтобы понимали нас все, будем говорить по-русски. Лекция будет на английском. Поэтому еще раз, если вы не понимаете английский, пожалуйста, возьмите наушники. Я супер счастлива. Меня зовут Аня Довгопол, я работаю в фонде Бёля, и я была инициаторкой этой лекции. Я вообще супер счастлива, что есть так много людей, потому что это уникальная лекция. Мы ее будем записывать, ей можно будет потом поделиться с друзьями, коллегами. Сегодня с нами будет говорить Ден Хілі. Ден Хілі – историк из Великобритании, из университета Оксфорда, и Ден был первым или одним из первых исследователей, который исследовал вопрос гомосексуальности в революционной России, в Советском Союзе. Ден работал в архивах, и я вот лично читала его книги, когда училась 15 лет назад в университете, и поэтому я вот супер счастлива и до сих пор не могу поверить, что вот сейчас у нас есть возможность послушать такого интересного человека. Я думаю, что можно будет задавать вопросы, но вот после лекции. Please.
Thank you. It's a great privilege and a great honor to be here with you to speak today. Thank you very much to the people who made this possible, including Anna and the Pride organizers, and also the British Embassy. Here's a new weapon of soft power from the United Kingdom. Okay, so I'm going to begin my lecture. Here we go. Good. We're starting in Canada in the 1970s. In Toronto in 1975, in its gay bookshop called Glad Day, I discovered a small book by John Lordson and David Thorstad called The Early Homosexual Rights Movement, as you can see here. The authors wrote in their introduction that the history of the first wave of gay liberation has been almost entirely suppressed, and thanks to the efforts of Stalinism and Nazism, many traces of it obliterated. I was truly shocked to read this, and I was to be even more shocked by the contents of the book. Nothing in my education in small-town Canada had prepared me for the news that 100 years before the Stonewall gay liberation moment, queer people had written, organized, and fought for their sexual and human freedom. The fact that so much thinking about our existence, our struggles, and our lives had been created by queers in Germany before and after the First World War, that so much political work had been conducted in that country and elsewhere in Europe and North America and in America, filled me with conflicting emotions, hope, wonder, and rage. And I was filled with outrage to learn that Nazi and Stalinist violence had destroyed almost all remnants of that heritage. And you can see some of that heritage here. Magnus Hirschfeld, of course, the great leader of the homophile emancipation movement before 1933, his Institute for Sexual Science, and two publications from the Weimar German era, one for women and one for men. The reason all this came as such a stunning shock was simple. In the early 1970s, when I came out as a teenager, it felt like gay liberation was building a brand new world. With no help from earlier generations of queers and no patterns, no models, or ideas except what we worked out for ourselves. The silence about homosexuality was almost total in my childhood. Think about an analog, paper-based information regime that suppressed access to learning about sexual orientation and gender dissent. You could put all the books about queerness into a modest ground floor flat or Victorian sitting room, the space that Glad Day Books occupied in a downtown Toronto apartment. For my gay generation in Canada, 1969 was year zero, and we were making up a revolution in real time from scratch. Looking back now, I realized that the North American gay liberation and lesbian feminist movements were not invented from scratch, and that we had a lot of cultural capital to draw upon. I was very young then, and a slightly older generation of gay activists used their experience of the New Left and anti-war movements to construct a gay liberation movement. A lot of Canadian gay liberationists were American draft dodgers. These were men who fled north to avoid being sent to the war in Vietnam. They used the tools and skills of those movements that those movements were built on to found Canada's most influential gay liberation newspaper, The Body Politic. The newspaper's collective often mentioned Lenin's insistence that the Bolsheviks should have a newspaper as the foundation of a viable political force. So they were quite leftist. The masthead cited German queer emancipationist Kurt Hiller, who was also a communist, and he paraphrased Marx when he declared that the liberation of homosexuals will only be the work of homosexuals themselves. The first generation of gay liberationists in Canada applied the same skills and energy to found a broad range of university-based and community institutions to help people come out, to campaign for political and social rights, and to make everyday life more livable for queers. All of that was work for the present and the future. And at the same time, the first generations of queer activists in North America and Europe began to ask questions about the past. Academic history ignored us. So much work was pursued by amateur historians and community activists. In my native Toronto, the Body Politic newspaper spawned a lesbian and gay archive, which is now the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives, based on its own records and on the growing contributions of the many organizations that came and went in community politics. Community historians, some graduate students, some literature and political science professors, some just ordinary laymen and women, wrote histories about famous lesbian and gay figures in the past. The lesbian and gay press carried many articles about the cultural, political, and social history of queer people, as these historians published work that our community was eager to read, even if the academic journals refused back then to even consider publishing such articles. Eventually, some amateur historians became academic historians, and in the Anglosphere, gay and lesbian history followed women's and Black and ethnic history as these new streams of scholarship entered the academic mainstream. It was not an easy transition, and it was marked by many exclusions and inequalities. So, for example, white, cis-male, gay men were the first to get tenure. Access to the resources and techniques of academic history proved a boon to lesbian and gay history writing. The amazing work on gay New York by George Chauncey, and on lesbian Buffalo, the city of Buffalo in New York State, by Kennedy and Davis, Boots of Leather, Slippers of Gold, taught us so much about the worlds made by queers long before Stonewall. We began to understand the extreme mutability of sexual identity, and the power of heteronormativity to destroy and obscure our fantastic experiments in world-making. In North America, the emphasis of attention was on identity construction, on the constitution of people hidden from history. In the German-speaking world, amateur and academic queer history concentrated on the destruction of the world's first homophile liberation movement by the Nazis, and on illuminating the world of queer creativity lost in 1933. German LGBT activists, as Eric Jensen has perceptively shown, linked the history of the repression of gay men and lesbians under the Nazi regime to the fascist persecution of socialists and communists. The recovery and public recognition of Germany's history of homophobic persecution drove forward political demands for the recognition of queer human rights and gave German and later European Union LGBT politics its particular power, its particular potency. I think that forgotten fact of the memory of Nazi persecution that spawned a visible and assertive LGBT politics in Europe explains why old Europe expected post-socialist countries joining Europe to accept LGBT rights as human rights upon accession to the European Union. To refuse to do so was to slide backward into the totalitarianism of the 20th century. The LGBT movement's embrace of academic history was also marred by many tragic losses because of the HIV/AIDS crisis. Eric Jensen argues that in the US, activists spoke about Nazi persecution and adopted the Nazis' pink triangle to associate fascist homophobia with the Jewish Holocaust, and to draw a parallel between the Holocaust and the AIDS crisis. He observes that in the 1980s and 1990s, writers and activists increasingly turned to the Holocaust as a metaphor for the contemporary epidemic and to the pink triangle as the most appropriate symbol of current suffering. For US queer activists, the pink triangle became a symbol of outrage and a promise not to allow a lost generation to be forgotten. Later battles over histories of the HIV/AIDS crisis and over the status of homosexuality and so-called asocial lesbianism under the Nazi regime showed that simplistic appropriations of the Jewish Holocaust and the pink triangle, or indeed the black asocial triangle, were not fully accurate as proper history. And yet, by the end of the 20th century, the power of history as a core tool for LGBT movements in the West was undeniable. Histories of oppression worked by addressing two audiences. By speaking inwardly to LGBT people, history had the power to unite and consolidate a movement. And by speaking outwardly to the mainstream, historical lessons about the dangers of intolerance could persuade politicians and the public to grant LGBT people full citizenship. Now, I've spoken at some length about the relationship between the Western LGBT movement and LGBT history writing, because we don't often think about how that relationship emerged and how the Western LGBT movement actively wrote its own histories. We also seldom question how natural it is that LGBT activism and history writing go together. In this talk, I want to ask that question with reference to the post-socialist countries of the former Soviet Union. Do LGBT movements in this region need history? Is a queer history of Latvia, of Ukraine, of Georgia, of Belarus, of Russia, so very necessary. Maybe LGBT people in the region should focus on the present, on the political issues that matter right now, and leave the history writing to retired people with time on their hands, or later generations when all the important political battles have been won. After all, it may seem pointless to sit in a library or an archive researching your history if your right to circulate that history is denied by a gay propaganda law. And anyway, in the digital world, the historical past is so last century. The contemporary information regime is entirely different to the one that I lived in as a teenager coming out in Canada in the 1970s. Now information is ubiquitous, it's everywhere. Who needs a usable past, a history, when the present is so constantly visible and urgent on our smartphones and our tablet screens? Why should post-socialist LGBT communities bother with their history? Well, my answers to these questions are going to focus first of all on the critics of LGBT history. And I will look at the accusations made against history with a capital H by queer theorists in the West. I also want to look at how historians answer these criticisms and how historians actually work today, or could work in post-socialist countries, to produce local queer histories. Finally, I will conclude by making some arguments about why LGBT history matters for the post-Soviet world, and why it is worth sitting in a library or digging in the archives to build, to construct, to nurture a queer past. I'm going to argue that a queer past will enable the construction of a better, richer, queer future, and that the post-Soviet world can use its queer past, not only in local and national conversations about queer citizenship, but also on a global stage to challenge the current domination of Western ways of thinking about the experience of LGBT people in the past. So turning to the trouble with history. If you're not an academic, you might be surprised to find that in the Western world, queer theorists and historians of queer sexualities often disagree with each other about the nature of history and what sort of memory work is important. This is an old discussion or debate in LGBT studies, and as a historian, I want to resist the urge to trace the fault lines back to the late 19th century and the earliest discussions and debates between homosexual intellectuals over the nature of gender and sexual variance and how it should be thought and written about for wider consumption. More recently, some queer theorists have asked whether the discipline of history is too straight to accommodate the queer past. They have asked whether there is such a thing as queer time and how it differs from straight time. Are the archives of governments, of public bodies, and private collections reliable enough resources for the reconstruction of a usable past? Is queer memory, shaped by queers and by present-day concerns, of more value to remembering collectives of queers than traditional history? 20 years ago, Lisa Duggan challenged LGBT scholars to relax their disciplinary boundaries and some of the methodological constraints that bolster them. Historians, she claimed, in other words, should think less rigidly about the queer past, and queer theorists, most of them scholars of literature and culture, should not be so quick to dismiss history and its possibilities. Other critics agreed. Conventional lesbian and gay historical work of the 1970s and 1980s, conforming to the rigors of the influential trends of social history, and trying to document the real, had done much to recuperate and restore past lives, and in the process to build communities. But history's empiricism and its alleged default setting to narratives of progress were said by queer theorists to have constrained the imagination and limited our emotional connections with the past. As well, professional gay and lesbian historians' reliance on what Duggan terms a stunted archive, one that queer historians complained was created and policed by a heteronormative world, confined us to a history written in that world's terms. Maybe some forms of historical reconstruction were possible, as Chauncey demonstrated for New York, or as Kennedy and Davis did for the city of Buffalo. But it seemed to some queer theorists, critics, that whole continents of queer experience were lost if we accepted the rules by which history is normally written. A particular feature of history writing is, we're no longer moving in the direction sorry. Технический перерыв. Thank you. Okay, so we're looking at the critics of conventional history writing. So one particular feature of history writing has been its tendency to Eurocentrism and to a West versus the rest perspective. One that for a long time ignored the post-colonial world, ignored global histories, and ignored the experience of marginalized peoples. Today we have to admit that the history of homosexuality, as recovered by the social historians of the 1970s and 1990s, was a Western narrative that usually failed to examine how colonial relationships with the rest of the world shaped our vision of queerness at home. An interesting recent example of this kind of critique comes from the scholar Heike Bauer, whose book, The Hirschfeld Archives, revisits the history of the early homosexual emancipation movement through a rigorous rereading of the work of Magnus Hirschfeld. Hirschfeld was, of course, the principal hero of Lauritsen and Thorstad's 1974 History of the Early Queer Movement that I read in the 1970s. He was a socialist, he was Jewish, he was a victim of Nazi persecution, he was a defender of the human rights of homosexuals and trans people. Bauer offers us a corrective, showing us that Hirschfeld's scientific study and his activism was implicated in German colonialism and often dependent on knowledge acquired in Germany's colonies in Africa or in anthropological comparison with other colonized peoples. Bauer argues that his defense of homosexuality in Germany was predicated on a strategy of highlighting trauma and exploitation, sometimes at the expense of racially or sexually excluded others. Similarly, Kaji Amin's Disturbing Attachments asks whether LGBT celebration of the life and activism of Jean Genet, the French writer, doesn't sometimes ignore the darker side of the French writer's attachment to forms of troubling racialized and intergenerational sexual affinities, basically prison pederasty. The heroes of queer history